Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Melissa Corkum. Welcome to the show, Melissa. Thank you for making time for us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Simon.
Yeah. So Melissa is not only an adoptee, an adoptive mom, and also an adoption professional. She's a fellow podcaster too. So she has a wealth of stuff and a wealth of different insights. And Melissa and I had a conversation last week, and she talked about being a bit of a having a fascination. I was going to say the word nerd, but I thought no, fascination. She got a fascination with nervous system science, and I thought I've never heard that word before, nervous system science. And last week I was reading Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey's book, What Happened to You. And it's all about trauma and nervous system stuff. So I thought that really piqued my interest. And as I thought about how we could explore Melissa's expertise, I came up with this idea of looking at neuroplasticity, because that's the reason that we've got hope. The neuroplasticity is the fuel for hope. The hope that the brainstem and the brain will change over time. That's kind of what neuroplasticity means to me, a non-expert. Would you say that's about right, Lisa?
Yeah, it's like the capacity or the ability for our nervous systems to change, like all the way down to like kind of the cellular biological level.
Yeah, fantastic. And what I loved about the Bruce Perry book was the hope, and they kept on saying the neuroplasticity stuff. And I thought, well, I'll keep reading, I'll keep listening to this book. I was listening to it, I was walking the dog, and I'm thinking, well, what other than understanding it's not what's wrong with us, it's what's happened to us, right? Which is clearly a big theme, and a realization that we can have, realization that we really need to take into our heart. What do we do? Like, what do we do? And I read something over the weekend that said that compound interest, so the way our money accumulates in a bank account on the back of more and more interest, is something like the fifth wonder of the world. And it struck me that actually what would be a better fifth wonder of the world in our world would be neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the fifth wonder of the world. And the question that came up to me was, what if neuroplasticity, what helps us oil the wheels of neuroplasticity? Because what we want to create is change within ourselves and within our kids. So we want the neuroplasticity to accelerate. We want the wheels to turn quicker, so that we come to a more regulated place more of the time, for the benefit of ourselves and for the benefit of the kids, so that they can thrive. So what do you make of that, Melissa?
Yeah, well, a couple of things came to my mind while you're asking that question, Simon. One is, I think there's just a biological imperative in nervous system science, or another term would be interpersonal neurobiology. And that's a term I think Dan Siegel probably coined, is that there is a simple biological imperative that we lose neuroplasticity over time. So, and that's just a factor of the fact that the brain naturally, when it's developing in children, is constantly changing. Like, that's part of the deal with growing and developing. And then it significantly slows down, for a lot of people in like their mid to early 20s. So there's that piece that when people talk about things like early intervention, and we focus a lot on younger generations, there is some science behind that, because there is naturally more neuroplasticity earlier on in our chronological life here. However, there's neuroplasticity all of the time. And I think that's really what you're getting at is, are there things practically we can do, even as adults, to increase our neuroplasticity? And I do think a lot of it comes down to something called felt safety, which is, again, not something we have a lot of decision over, but something that's kind of an instinct in our nervous system called neuroception that is deciding whether or not we're safe or not safe based on our history and a number of different factors. But ultimately, I also think the way that we were created and designed is to be in relationship. And, whether you believe in intelligent design or just, by chance, there's science to support that the relationship part of the human experience is super important. And that's a lot of what interpersonal neurobiology, what Dan Siegel came up with. And I think relationships, really healthy, safe relationships, are probably the breeding ground of neuroplasticity.
Felt safety. Yeah, as you were talking about set in our ways and changes in neuroplasticity over time, I was thinking, we get set in our ways. So all of us, to a lesser or greater extent, and the one that always comes to me is that I say this like I'm joking, right, listeners? We've got this thing in the UK called grumpy old men. Right. And I say, ask an American, have you got this? Do you have this phenomenon over your side of the pond? And obviously I'm going to say a man, because when I'm talking to a woman, because it is generally men that are grumpy as they get older. There are the exceptions that prove the rule. But we kind of we believe our beliefs, don't we? We believe our beliefs. And the example that I was thinking we mentioned last time, Melissa, was this British real type A superhero marathon runner, gold medalist, guy called James Cracknell, who got almost killed by hitting a truck when he was cycling across the States, and he's got brain damage. Right, he knows he's got brain damage. But to me, he still believes what's going on in his head. He doesn't question it. And for me, you can talk about neuroplasticity is changing our mind. It's changing our mind, and by that I mean you can change your mind whether you like brown sauce or red sauce, right? You can change your mind. You never test, but that's you can change your mind on a very superficial level, but you can change your mind on a very deep level in terms of what you're talking about in terms of felt safety, and seems to me that what you're saying is it's relationships. You said relationships are the fertile ground for increasing felt safety.
Yeah, I would say increasing felt safety and that neuroplasticity you're talking about. And this is why I say that, because our nervous system has 3 different physiological states, and they were defined by a brilliant guy named Stephen Porges. And we can either be in a state in our nervous system that's very open and engaged and trusting. He called it social engagement. Some people have also called it rest digest. It's when all of our regulatory systems in our nervous system are working the way that they were meant to. Our heart rate's regulated, our digestive system's moving the way it should. All the resources are going to, the proper places in our body. But if we feel threat or stress, we can drop into one of two different reactions. The first is an activated response to stress. And so a lot of people will hear that as fight or flight, right? It's a response in the nervous system that says, I should fight against this thing or run away from it in order, for my survival. And it looks like a lot of different things behaviorally in a lot of different people. And then if that doesn't seem like it's working, then the body kind of goes into this, like, I'll just play dead. I'll conserve my energy. I'll shut down. And so that's looks like freeze or fold. And it looks like a lot of other things. And each of those stress responses has a cascade of other physiological effects in the body in terms of what happens with our heart rate and our digestion and our, even how much saliva we produce. I mean, tons of things. And so we tend to be very self-focused, egocentric for survival if we're in a stress response, right? We're not thinking about the people around us. We're not trying to connect. We're just, we're in it, for our own survival. And so a lot of times that looks like behavior that might be, maybe a little bit more selfish, or, if we assign a value to it, right? It's not socially acceptable behavior in a lot of ways. But it's that being able to connect to and co-regulate is the term, connect with another human being that reminds us we're okay, or that we can do this, even if the circumstances are extremely stressful. Resilience has been defined less by kind of what happened to you, but who was with you when the thing happened to you, right? And so we see people in history who have experienced and witnessed horrific circumstances, but who had a safe relationship that allowed them to either co-regulate or make sense of their experience. And so they were resilient in it. It didn't, create a confirmation bias of I'm always in danger. Whereas there are other things where, like, for example, one of our children had an experience where she was choking because she disobeyed a rule in where she was living. And it was never a serious, it was never that she couldn't actually breathe. It was never a medical actual emergency, but she felt very alone in it because she didn't feel like she could tell anyone that it was happening. And that created a tremendous amount of PTSD for her. But then you have other people who have come through, maybe horrific trafficking experiences or civil wars, but who were able to maintain some kind of connection. They had another family member or somebody that they went through that experience with, and they were able to co-regulate each other. And so they emerge as people who write books and speak about their experience and seem very resilient to such a horrific experience.
Yeah. So confirmation bias is kind of like sounds like a posh word for me for being set in our ways. Like we believe our beliefs.
Yes.
And the beliefs snowball. So it's like we what do we? I mean, I did a bit of NLP. I left that behind there, but it's what to generalize, distort, and yeah, we see everything everywhere. So I saw this on I was watching a TV program last night, and it was a property a property renovation competition show. So this woman kept on saying, yeah, this always happens to me. We always have disasters. And I'm thinking, well, it's not really a disaster. It's just the fact that the guys left some, you ordered a new unit for your kitchen, and the guys left the screws out of the box. And but it's a disaster. Disasters always happen to me. Well, it's not really a disaster, is it? It's not, it's not you. But we are all doing this all the time. We are all doing that to a lesser or greater extent. We're generalizing it. It just so happens that we can see other people's generalizations a lot easier than we can see ourselves, right?
Yeah. I tell parents this a lot, our ability to observe other people is what we call like a concrete observance, like it's easy to see what's outside of ourselves when even our 3-year-old granddaughter can see someone else breaking a rule in our house and call it out, right? But self-awareness, that like self-observation is a little bit more abstract. Like, and so parents will say like, well, my kid knows the rules because he can, he's always tattling on his sibling, but then he's going and breaking the rule himself and he doesn't understand why that's a problem, right? And that's a difference between concrete understanding and abstract understanding.
Yeah. So use this word self-awareness, and I used to think that kind of like the self-awareness was about like noticing our behaviors. That's how I think most people see it. They talk about being aware of their behaviors or being aware of their beliefs.
I like to be a little bit more specific about it. And
Right.
I'll bring Enneagram language in just because I do love the Enneagram and because I think it does give us really good language. But I think specifically, and because I think some of us excel at each of these areas more than others, it's being able to notice our thoughts, our thought patterns. It's being able to notice and be aware of and connected to our bodies. And then also our emotions. So like thoughts, body awareness, and emotional awareness. And behaviors kind of, are sit above all of those things, but ultimately behavior stems from some, those types of things, how we're feeling, what we're thinking. And then that like kind of gut move or gut reaction. But you'll find that people tend to be more likely to be self-aware about one or the other. And there's one that they have a lot of trouble connecting to.
Yeah. So back to the relationships piece then, in terms of relationships being the driver of felt safety. What wisdom? Oh yeah, did we talk about this last week? This post-traumatic wisdom. See, I say this quite a lot on the podcast, right? So everybody's heard of post-traumatic stress. Everybody's heard of that, despite the fact that 80 to 90% of people that go through post-traumatic stress events don't get it. Nobody says that. Nobody talks about post-traumatic growth, and nobody talks about post-traumatic wisdom. Actually, that was the post-traumatic wisdom was in Bruce Perry and the Oprah book. So I was pleased to hear that post-traumatic wisdom. So because this is the hope of the hope it's going to get better, right? And we have a media that is so obsessed with giving us negative stuff, bad news. If it bleeds, it leads, is the story. Yeah. If it bleeds, if it bleeds, it leads. It leads, as in it's the biggest headline on the on the paper, or the loudest headline, largest point size on a web page. So what wisdom can you bring to this to this topic of increasing, improving, enhancing this felt safety?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a slow process. It's, we do this exercise in parent groups a lot where we ask them to think of something that they believe, with all their heart, mind, and soul. And often I use the example that, like the sky is blue or something. And then I ask, well, how often would that need to be different for your belief to change? And so I use the example of a sky because I can kind of, I think people can conceptualize it, but I'll say like, say you woke up one day and the sky was like green, and you would probably think, well, that's weird. I wonder like if there was a chemical leak somewhere. Like we would come up with excuses for why we thought this anomaly had happened. You wouldn't wake up one day with a different colored sky and just think, oh, the sky must have changed, like now it's no longer blue. Like you would try to explain it away in some way. And then if you woke up the next morning and the next morning, the next morning, and the sky still wasn't blue, you would still keep explaining, well, man, it's taking a long time for this, whatever this is, to clear out of the air, And then maybe there's like a break in the green and you see a little sliver of blue and you're like, I knew the sky was blue, and then you wake up for another 2 months and the sky's still not blue and you think, yeah, this is bad. This is bad. But you still think the sky's like blue up there somewhere. And so it's the same thing with like confirmation bias in our felt safety. If our early experiences have told us that humans aren't safe, people can't be relied on, the world is not trustworthy or reliable, that's what you assume. And if somebody comes along and is nice or safe, you think about like a child in the foster care or adoption system has had early abuse or neglect and comes to a safe family, and this foster or adoptive family is kind and thoughtful and all of those things, and this child's thinking, this is so weird, this isn't what I'm expecting, they must be trying to get something from me, or they're explaining it away. And then we're all human, and so we lose our temper, we yell, or we say something that we regret or whatever, and then that's the sliver of blue sky, right? That's that like, oh, I knew people weren't trustworthy, I knew I couldn't. And it could even just be a dismissive thing, like, you're fine, you're not hurt, whatever. Like, I knew I couldn't trust people, I knew they didn't get me. And that's just one slip up, but it's just enough to continue confirming that bias. And so it just takes a lot of repetition. If we think about it from a brain science perspective, the patterns that confirmation bias in the brain is a series of what we call neuro pathways, right? There's a stimulus in the outside environment and it travels through our brain, through all these neuro pathways, and kind of like developing a rut in a road. The more a pathway is used, the easier that pathway is for, an experience to travel and be interpreted. And so neuroplasticity is really the act of creating new neural pathways through different experiences. And so that's what we're going after, right? We're looking to kind of retire an old rut in the road and create a new rut, but it takes a lot of repetition.
Okay. I guess I heard another metaphor on the same sort of metaphor, right? So you've been driving to work the same way and it's taking you 45 minutes. And then somebody tells you about a new way and it shaves 20 minutes off your clock, of the time to get to work. And you're never going to do that old way again because you've had a realization that's deep enough to change the way that you plan your day. So sometimes we have those epiphanies and the world is completely different afterwards. And sometimes it takes a lot longer. And I'm guessing that there's a continuum. And I think you used the word patience. And that to me is perhaps one of the biggest things. So I swim a lot, and I see a lot of people down the swimming pool like me doing it to keep fit, or get fit, maybe lose a little bit of weight. It takes an awful long time to do that. So most people will prefer to diet because you can lose weight faster dieting than you can through exercise. It's, if I can burn I can burn 500 calories in half an hour swimming. So if I want to go on a crash, if I want to lose weight quickly, I can just stop eating, which means I don't take in 2,000 calories, or I have to swim for 2 hours. And it's like, who's got time to swim for 2 hours? It's like it's a patience. It must be a patience thing. And
a little bit, but maybe this is taking the metaphor too far too, but as human beings, we don't love change. Like big changes kind of throw up red flags in our nervous system. And so the reason why those things that you're talking about aren't easy, either to change your habit to go to the swimming pool or to diet long term, right? I mean, we call them crash diets and fad diets for a reason, because they don't last, is that when we have been eating 3,000 calories, pretty consistently, and then we just up and decide that we're going to cut it back by even 500 calories, that's a pretty significant change to the body. And so we can do that for a day, a week or something. And at some point you bounce back to the old rut, because it's creating stress in the nervous system to make that big of a change, and your body's constantly fighting against it. And so at some point you run out of willpower and you go back to the old rut in the road, because that's easier. We're looking, like, our brains are looking for the path of least resistance.
Yeah. So what does that mean for an adoptive parent, in terms of, I guess the first thing is that kids will snap back on despite neuroplasticity, they're going to snap back. So you're going to go 3 steps forward, 1 step back. Would that be fair?
I think it has a couple practical ramifications for adoptive families. I think one, just starting with ourselves as adoptive parents, it means we can be kinder to ourselves in terms of our own parenting, right? Because sometimes we fall into bed every night and think, man, that was not a good day with our kids. And I really need, maybe you've read, maybe a parent goes to a conference or reads a book like What Happened to You or The Connected Parent or something. And they're like, from a cognitive perspective, they get it. Like, oh, I need to do something differently here. Like I see that the behavior might stem from some kind of trauma thing. It's not them just being like a jerk to me. And we fall into bed exhausted and we think tomorrow, like, we'll do better tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes, and like I said, like path of least resistance, like we fall into old behavior patterns very quickly. And so by 10 o'clock in the morning, you've already punished your kid after you said you weren't going to, and lost your cool, and all that compassion that you read in the book kind of all goes out the window. And so I think when I work with parents towards change, like we have to be kind to ourselves. We have to recognize our own nervous system limits and capacities, and how we change and what type of change we're looking for and the speed at which we're looking for it. And then, so I think that gives us more compassion for ourselves. And then I think it also gives us more compassion for our kids, because we can start to understand how hard it is to switch a confirmation bias. And so I think we just need a lot more kindness for everyone all the way around.
Yeah. So what are the main things that you've learned raising your kids in terms of this relationship stuff?
I think the hardest thing I had to learn, and this is coming from, again, someone who probably overvalues control. My husband might call me a control freak, and so I think, especially because we parented 2 kids by birth first, who we took our kind of safe relationship foundation for granted. And so there were some things behaviorally when they were young children that we could kind of change, like behavior modification things that kind of traditional parenting says, well, if you do this again, I'm going to give you a timeout. And you kind of like train behavior out of kids. That worked for them. And so it gave me this false sense of control and power that I could shape who my kids were going to become. And once we added 4 kids through adoption that had various levels of, adverse experiences in their past, that all went out the window, because they were being driven by fear and dysregulation, and they didn't have a safe attachment figure. And so they were kind of on their own. And so what I had to realize was I can just control myself, and I can influence what happens around me and the nervous systems of other people around me. But the most powerful thing I can do is figure out my own triggers, my own nervous system, what regulates me, and I can take care of my nervous system well. And it seems like such a cop-out thing to say, but co-regulation, mirror neurons, like our effect that our nervous system has on other people around us is significant. And so don't underestimate, if you're a parent listening, don't underestimate how much trickle down effects, like change, can happen in your family if you just start, caring for and having control over your own nervous system.
Yeah. I mean, it's a constant, it's not a constant. It's a common thread amongst a lot of the really wise, experienced guests that we have on the show, that it starts with us. This is about how we're being, not about parenting techniques.
Yeah. And trust me, Simon, like I say that from all the experience of trying it the other way in the world. I mean, we had 3 kids who moved out of our house because I was trying so hard to control, to just improve my parenting technique in order that I could control their behaviors better. Right. And it was ugly. It was so ugly. And no one was happy. I wasn't happy. They weren't happy. And so I learned all of this the hard way. So this isn't just from theory and reading and the things. I've tried it both ways, and we got a massive redo in our life with our kids doing it this other way, limping towards doing it this other way, because we're not even perfect at that. But at least, knowing's half the battle, right? So yeah, and it's just brilliantly different. And it's harder in some ways because it's always hard to let go of our sense of control of something, but it's so much more beautiful. And I think it's creating, to go back to where we started this conversation, I think it's laying the foundation and creating and, kind of oiling the wheels of our kids' nervous systems to have continued neuroplasticity, because we're creating that rather than just trying to control and change them in our own way.
So if I can draw together two things that you said, it seems to me is that you had this confirmation bias that it was all about control.
Mm-hmm.
until you didn't. So was there a particular big realization of this, or was it a series of smaller insights, or what led you to that shift from technique to from, how would you say it, from control, from trying to control them to trying to know yourself?
It's a great question. There were a couple things. So I had been reading, what we call trauma-informed parenting resources. So there was some knowledge in my head that I hadn't really fully grasped, the significance of. And I would say there were 2 huge things that happened. One was just 3 years after we adopted teens from Ethiopia. I had tried to control their life so much, and they were so not in for it. and they just didn't have any attachment to us because they had come at 13 and 14. And I had spent a lot of time trying to control things, like music and friends and what they, I was trying to help them be healthy and all the things. Like none of the things were like, terrible on paper. It was like, don't just like, like a street girl when you go to school, and like, don't make, meet up with strange friends on the internet and, those types of things. But when you're 16 and 17, you don't want to hear any of that. And when you're 16 and 17 and you've only known the people who are trying to control you for 3 years, you don't have a lot of like, there's not a basis of years of positive experiences to draw on. And so our oldest kids at 16 and 17 went to a program that we have here in the States called Job Corps, and it's a government funded program, and they were able to live on campus. And so basically like they found a ticket out. They did not want to live in our house anymore. And so they left really with no plans of returning, right? Like they packed their bags at 16 and 17. They didn't really want to come home for Christmas break or stay in touch with the family. They were just looking for a legal way to move out before 18, right? And so that, I mean, that's a pretty big wake up call, right? When 2 of your kids like leave because they don't want to be with you anymore. And then the other thing that happened, I was at a parent training, and they had us do this exercise where we had 3 columns in our paper. One column was we were supposed to list things we had control over, things we had influence over, and then things we had no control over. And it, for whatever reason, and I know it doesn't sound like rocket science, but like it just hit me like a ton of bricks that like I didn't have anything but myself to put in the I have control over column, right? Like I could put a lot of things in the influence column, but the difference between influence and control, I had never really thought about. And I realized like I can't control who their friends are, what they're wearing, what they're doing, like none of that. And so then all of a sudden it was like, whoa, like, okay, like something has to change because there's all this cognitive dissonance now around the way that I thought good parents should be. And now I'm looking at this chart and it's telling me in black and white ink that I don't actually have control over my kids. And then also I can see how my trying to control my kids, really damaged our relationship.
So is cognitive dissonance when the content of the cortex, which is kind of the sense part of the brain, is conflicting with what's in the brainstem, which is the kind of like the first part of the brain to form. Is cognitive dissonance happening there, or why did I make it such a leading question? What's cognitive dissonance, please? Sorry, that's a far better, easier question to ask.
Yeah, I'm probably not the person to give like the official definition, but what it means to me is kind of 2 conflicting truths. And so maybe it's not the brainstem and the cognitive part disagreeing. It's more like 2 thoughts in your in your conscious space all of a sudden don't make sense to live together anymore. And something, I think that's where change comes, right? Something has to go. And so for me, like the cognitive dissonance was I had grown up with this idea of what successful parenting looked like. And it had something to do with behavior and had something to do with my ability as a parent to shape and change and ultimately control my kids' behavior. Because we look at when we look at kids who are struggling, whether it be as simple as like throwing a tantrum on the market floor versus kids who are maybe older teens who are struggling with addiction, we kind of naturally, at least I did, kind of think like, what happened in the parenting thing? Like if, I used to say, look at these poor mothers with these like tantruming toddlers and think like my kid will never, like I'll never let my kid do that in a grocery store or whatever. And that's not true. Like I had it happen plenty of times to me. But this idea that our kids' behavior reflects our parenting, right? I think is this thing I hear that I experience and I hear from a lot of the parents that I serve. And so that there was that thought rolling around in my head. And then all of a sudden this thought of this realization that I can't control them. And so I'm like, well, how does that work? If I'm actually only in control of myself, but then my definition of parenting, good parenting, has to do with controlling my kids. right? Do you feel like there's tension there?
Yeah. So cognitive dissonance is a clash between an old way of thinking and a new way of thinking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for some people, I think a lot of people hold cognitively dissonant ideas and they try to live them out. They're maybe ideas that have been there for a long time, and they're not realizing how dissonant it is. And so, we talk about people maybe who are hypocrites or who are talking out of both sides of their mouth. Like, I think it's just a thing that we do as humans. We try to make two things that actually can't be true at the same time be true at the same time.
Yeah. Interesting. You used the word hypocrite. For me, no, I heard this a while ago, and it really stuck with me. It was a new insight, right? Nobody follows a hypocrite, as in, like hypocrites aren't good leaders. So I was on a business program, and there was a business event. I was at a business event, and there was this woman there who was morbidly obese, and she was talking about, and her company was a school catering company, and nobody seemed to know. Maybe it's just because we're British and middle class, and we don't talk about these sorts of things, but I could not, if I'd been in a school, I couldn't have contracted with this woman for healthy school dinners, because she doesn't walk the talk. She talks the talk. She doesn't walk the talk. She's like a hypocrite. So, and I think for me, felt safety is when people do what they say they're going to do, and they are consistent. So, like consistency. Like people talk about, I heard a lot of adoptive mums, and people talk about kids coming from chaos into consistency. So start, they're consistent, like they have a schedule, and the kids aren't used to the schedule, so they kick off a little bit because they're not used to it, right? But consistency is more about meal times. It's about being able to trust, somebody. And I'm talking now from my personal perspective, and also talking from an adult perspective rather than a kid's perspective. But as soon as you said the word felt safety, right? And the first thing that came into my mind was about 4 months after I started going out with with Lynn, who's now my wife. Was I was driving somewhere, and I was trying. This idea came into my head: why do I love Lynn? And the only cognitive idea that could come up with, because I mean, love is a love thing, right? It's a feelings thing. It's not a thought thing, But the thing was, she does what she says she's going to do. She does what she says she's going to do, and she's consistent in that. And I'm thinking, like, last year we were having this extension. So I'm sitting in an office now. I'm sitting in my home office. It was built last year, and the contractor was, to put it nicely, was a liar, right? He never did what he said he was going to do. And I didn't feel safe with the guy because I couldn't trust him. I really couldn't trust him. And those are, I'm trying to think back, from because this felt safety thing, it's called felt safety. it's an experience, isn't it? It's something that it's experienced. It's something that we feel in our bones. It's not an
It's
idea.
subconscious. Yeah. So
Yeah.
like, even if all of the logic says you're safe, you can still lack felt safety.
Yeah. So what have you learned about helping kids, adopted kids, feel that safety?
There's a lot of parenting techniques that lend themselves towards helping our kids feel safe. Like I said, it's a long road. And then I mentioned Dr. Porges earlier. He has developed an auditory therapeutic protocol called the Safe and Sound protocol, which is, and there aren't many nervous system shortcuts, but it is a quicker way to help flip that confirmation bias and create felt safety. It is not magic, and it still takes a shift in parenting if parents aren't parenting in such a way that kind of communicates felt safety. But I tell parents, the goal is to parent and be in relationship with a child in such a way that you're, in as many ways as possible, communicating felt safety, a message of felt safety, and an offering of felt safety. And the Safe and Sound protocol is a huge part of that, especially if kids are really fragile in their felt safety. But it's things like, so let me back up. The nervous system subconsciously is taking data from 3 different areas to make this felt safety determination. It's all happening lightning fast subconsciously, but it's taking data from our bodies internally, the environment around us, and then cues from other nervous systems around us. And our nervous systems are, without words, communicating with 50 billion bits of information potentially a second. Like, there's just so many things below the surface that we don't know. And so, what does that look like to make sure, do our best to make sure that there's not internal cues of danger happening, and that could be as simple as a child who's had early adversity getting hungry or thirsty. That could set a ton of alarm bells off depending on their history. There could be certain sounds, textures, lights that we need to think about. And then that relational felt safety, what's my nervous system telling your nervous system, separate from the words that are coming out of my mouth.
So how does our own self of our own, so the most important nervous system that an adopted child is around is their parents' nervous systems, right?
Yeah, like in a primary attachment figure. Mm-hmm.
So what does this have to, what implications does that have in terms of our own felt safety?
Well, Dr. Purvis was famous for saying we can only bring our child to a place of healing as far as like we can take ourselves, right? And so if our nervous system struggles to be in felt safety for whatever reason, I mean, there could be reasons in our past. It could be just ways that, maybe we have sound sensitivity, right? And we're parenting 3 loud kids, right? And they're not being, quote unquote bad. They're just loud. But what if that makes it hard in my nervous system to regulate because I'm sensitive to sound, I'm sensitive to noise. So we can only provide that sense of felt safety in so much as we are feeling safe ourselves. Okay. And again, it's the same for us. It's also subconscious. So if we have events or things in our past that make it hard for us to hang on to a sense of felt safety, then we have to be aware of that too and be kind to ourselves. It's not our fault, right? But the same way that we bring compassion to, quote unquote, kids from trauma or kids from hard places, we have to bring that same compassion to our own selves and whatever our confirmation bias is in our own nervous system. And at the same time, we also have to be, we are called on to be the adults in the situation with our kids.
Yeah. Well, somebody said to use the word unknown unknowns to me recently. Was that you? Did you say that word, unknown unknowns? Is that one of yours?
It was not me.
No, okay.
Well, yes, we were talking about that quadrant of
Consciousness, yeah.
consciousness of like
Yeah.
conscious knowing and not, or
Yeah. So there's a ladder that goes from it's I think it's called the conscious competence ladder. And essentially it's the stuff, it's the unknowns if we know we've got an issue with somebody, then not an issue with somebody, if we've got an issue with something that's going on within us, then we can take some action. But if it's the unknown unknowns, which are if it's a minefield, we don't know when.
Right. We don't even know what we don't know. It's like when you start asking questions about, it's like when some people maybe go to their car mechanic, like they don't even know the questions to ask. Like they don't know enough. Well, I guess in that sense, maybe it's conscious incompetence, but there's also a sense of unconscious incompetence about lots of things.
So have you come across any tools that will give us a 360 degree view of our own stuff, shall we say, so that we can understand? Well, the opposite of safety is danger, right? So have you got, are there any tools, questionnaires that you've come across that help us realize what's going on within our own nervous system? Or is that what the Enneagram's about?
I think the Enneagram gives us really good questions and wakes us up to a lot of our unconscious incompetencies. I think also there are probably some scales and questionnaires to think about. But ultimately, I think it's work that really can't be shortcutted with just a simple evaluation. I think it's work that we kind of have to do in community, whether that be group work or, working with a coach or therapist or someone, because at the end, really, it's still all about relationship. And so a lot of times an impartial, objective person who's just a little bit on the outside, who can hold that space for you, is what creates that safety for exploration. Because even an assessment, while it might ask you some questions that you might not have been thinking about, there's still a level of awareness you need to even fill one of those out even accurately, right? So I think it's a very dynamic process that can't be kind of boxed in.
Okay. One of the, I asked you what kind of self-awareness was before, and you said, well, it's about our thoughts, our thought patterns, our feelings, and our behaviors. And I've got to. I don't think that any of those are actually who we are, right? We say self-awareness, but we're not our thoughts, are we?
No, we're not. I mean, I think there's, in some ways, it's like apples and oranges. I think in the practical sense, for what people are looking for, we have to think about how we impact people around us, right? And so what our bodies are doing, what we're feeling, what we're thinking are all things that we have to be aware of. And I come from a faith tradition that, talks like about our just inherent worth as created by God. And so there's that piece. But, if I'm a jerk to you, Simon, it still matters, even if I'm technically, like, my worth is not created by my behavior. Like, that still, those things still matter in day-to-day life, even if I'm ultimately, a valuable creation by God. How I treat other people, still matters.
Yeah, that's a good point. A great point indeed. And I think it flips me round back to the question that I asked you just a couple of minutes ago. In giving people a practical thing to look at, because I know people crave the practicalities and what do I do? So, and I can be quite philosophical. So my own approach is focusing on that, exploring that self-worth, like you're talking about. That's for me is the ultimate. That's how I spend my. That's my work on myself that I do.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I found it very useful to get an impartial view. Well, not an impartial, a more impartial view of myself is like looking at emotional intelligence books and questionnaires, because it all starts with us. Like, so parenting starts with us, relationships with others start with us, and emotional intelligence seems to be that space. So I don't know whether there are kind of like emotionally aware adoptive parenting resources. I don't know whether there are such a thing, but that's what it seems to. Those are the things that are occurring to me, and that's a rich area.
Well, I think we're looking for integration, right? So integration is something that comes up both in interpersonal neurobiology, it comes up in the Enneagram, and it's this idea of not giving any of those areas that you're talking about maybe the ultimate, right? And also because we're each born with a different leaning or bent or motivation towards one or the other, towards prioritizing or relying more on like emotions and sense of self, and the more philosophical idea of self and shame versus thoughts and logic and behaviors versus, all these things, is that ultimately we want to integrate our ability to talk about and experience and hold space for all of those things in other people, in ourselves and other people, in an integrated way, so that we can relate to other people in the best ways possible, and not overemphasize or ignore, parts of who we are in essence.
Yeah. So I sometimes like to ask this question, Melissa. What's the question that I've not asked?
What's the question you haven't asked? Well, we've certainly covered a lot of great ones. I don't know.
Okay. That's great.
It is
Not
great.
knowing is great, right?
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, and we have covered quite a lot of ground. So there may be some. If you've got this far, listener, then the chances are your brain isn't still aching, because you would have turned us off long before now. So as always, I would suggest you to check out the show notes and have a look at what Melissa's doing if what she's saying is making sense to you, because she's clearly got a huge amount of insight and experience in this area. And not only that, she's got this theoretical overlay. So the theory and the practice come together in Melissa in a lovely way. When we're looking at this stuff called the complicated scientific stuff like the nervous system science and the daily ups and downs of raising kids. So I'd urge you to check out her links, check out what she's doing on social, check out her podcast as well. And all that remains for me to say is thank you very much for coming on the show, Melissa.
Well, yeah, again, it's great conversation. It's always good to talk to you, Simon. Thanks so much for having me.
You're a star. Thank you very much, listeners, and we will speak to you very soon. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.